So again, my name is Jas Banga. I'll be today's host, and my email and contact information can be found there below. So if anyone has any questions or concerns or particular questions regarding their current office lease agreement or any potential sites that they're looking to address to start their practice, I'd be happy to do so. Again, my name and number can be found right below. So moving along, just to give you an idea and a sense about our group, who we are, what we do, and how we've been supporting the healthcare community. We were essentially founded by a group of doctors back in 1994, really to give doctors greater clarity on their office lease agreements, their terms, conditions, and obligations that they're committing towards in their agreements with their landlord. So when we initially started, there was a bit of a gap in the industry in terms of specific representation for the healthcare industry. So for the last 25 years, we have analyzed over 10,000 healthcare office leases. We have represented the interests of not only medical professionals, but also dentists, veterinarians. The similar challenges that the healthcare community faces, regardless of the industry you're in, are very common across the industry. So since our beginning, our inception as a group, we've negotiated over 10,000 lease agreements, and on a yearly basis, we negotiate over 500 medical leases, whether that's in this part of Canada, here in Toronto, or across the country, some parts of the U.S. So we're very familiar with the landlord community and what the landlord community is asking for from our healthcare tenants. On an annual basis, we will review and assess the legal and financial merits of over 1,000 office lease agreements. So very familiar with the various types of standard, quote-unquote, standard form leases. Again, there is no standard form lease agreement, just as a little side note. Every office lease agreement is fundamentally different, and as we go through today's lecture, I will be discussing various provisions, terms that are often found in a common lease agreement. However, each one is specific to areas, the landlord, so very different at the core, but some of the language is very often found to be the same. And then in addition, we also provide over 150 CE seminars really to educate the community, the healthcare community, about the specifics and the fundamentals of their lease agreement. So as we move forward, I will be addressing many questions and concerns that are often found in a traditional office lease agreement. Just to give some background and some context behind our group and some of the work we've done, you may recognize some of your colleagues here. We have represented the interests of many doctors, whether they're specialists or medical doctors, general doctors. We have worked with and advised many doctors across the country, all the way from Las Vegas, California, New York, Florida, down south in Texas. So again, very familiar with the conversations that many landlords are expecting their clients to have, and we do that on behalf of clients on a daily basis, and that's fundamentally what we do on a daily basis, is represent the interests of doctors, whether you're a healthcare tenant, a dentist, or a veterinarian. And the same goes for Canada. Again, in Canada, very similar conversations in the terms of prepping a landlord for having a healthcare tenant. As a healthcare tenant, you are one of the most sought-after types of tenants in a property, and we have represented the interests all the way from BC to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, as well as all over Ontario. So again, very familiar with the specific nuances of how healthcare operations are set up on a provincial level as well as a national level. So, very important to understand what it takes on a community level and to address particular elements that are specific to a local area, because fundamentally each area is a bit different, and how structuring a lease in British Columbia is a little bit different than structuring a lease in Ontario based on regulations and guidelines. But of course, part of our internal process is to be aware of each area's specific issues and concerns and how to address them. So you may recognize some of your colleagues here on this quick slide. So moving forward, what is the purpose of today's webinar? So the purpose of today's webinar is threefold. We'll be discussing the importance of the medical office lease agreement, how it is a fundamental document, really aligning the practice with the bricks and mortar, and it is one of the most important documents that we'll ever sign in our career. We'll highlight that and give you an understanding of why that is important, and I do want to stress the significant importance of the office lease agreement. We'll also discuss the key components that will help you grow, protect, and eventually sell the practice, how we can remain in the property, not be aware of getting into default, having long-term continuity and protections built into the lease agreement, and then also having the lease agreement allow us to eventually transfer and sell the business. And then I'll also provide some action plans, some critical tips and practical advice that you should be taking into consideration as you navigate the commercial real estate world and structuring your lease agreement. So the first question I'd like to pose to everyone in today's webinar is, what is a lease? What is this document that's put in front of us by the landlord community with the expectation that we are to sign and in which we are committing for a long period of time? Well, first and foremost, the lease agreement is a check. It is arguably one of the biggest checks that you will ever sign in your entire career. It is at the foundation of your business. It is the document that helps you to stay in your space and structures the relationship between you as a tenant and the property owner, the landlord. But again, I do want to fundamentally give you all an understanding that the lease agreement is a large check. It is a financial commitment for many years in which we are exchanging money for the use and privilege to use a landlord's property. So why is this document so important? Well, first and foremost, it provides long-term stability and security for us as a tenant. It provides us continuity in the space and predictability that we will be secure as a tenant in the property, and it gives us an idea of how we should be structuring our long-term plan. I'm a firm believer in structuring our real estate plan in collaboration with our transition plan, making sure that there's an alignment between what our real estate strategy is as well as our retirement plan and our eventual transition and sale of our business. We also look to minimize any risk and exposures, minimizing any personal liabilities, separating your personal assets from your practice assets. Very important that is structured here in the lease agreement. And of course, we do want to structure the lease document to maximize your flexibility, allow you to continue to practice for the entirety of your career, but also have the flexibility to eventually transfer and sell the business, have the flexibility to grow your business by having expansion rights built into the agreement, having flexibilities in the form of death and disability. God forbid something happens to you as a practitioner, whether that be a mental incapactation, a physical disability, or God forbid, a death whereby you can terminate or have your estate terminate the lease. Critical that we have that structured into the lease agreement in terms of maximizing our flexibility. But for most doctors, because it is one of the largest checks that we ever write, it's critical that we get the economics appropriate and done correctly from the onset so that we have fair and affordable financial terms, not only for today, but for the predictable future, and that we're aware of what the cost will be many years from when we initially signed the lease agreement. And of course, the lease document does have broad implications on our ability to eventually sell the practice. We do like to structure a lease that will enhance that ability, and moving forward, we're able to do so with minimal risk or landlord interference. So when we look at a practice itself, at the core, when a practice is being appraised, it's often appraised on three fundamental factors. Of course, this is industry specific. For many specialists, this equation would be a little bit different, but on a whole, it does follow a very similar pattern. This pie chart isn't specific to how an appraisal is allocated, but it would give you a general sense of the value of particular elements that fall into that appraisal. So one factor that does go into the appraisal is the depreciated value of the equipment. As a healthcare practitioner, we often invest quite heavily into equipment, more so on the specialist side. And when we sell, we do recuperate those costs, albeit on a depreciated value. But that does factor into the overall valuation of the business when we get the practice appraised. The second factor that does play a large part is the goodwill. How many patients do we have? How much income does each patient derive for us? And of course, many doctors operate on different models, whether you're operating on a FIG model here in Ontario or a full model. Of course, in the U.S., it's state-by-state specific, as well as different parts of Canada. It's very different operations based on the controlling and governing bodies for the industry. But essentially, at the root of each state or province, the goodwill is a function of the average income each patient provides us on an annualized basis. And that does have a heavy influence based on patient retention and patient recall, how often the patient is coming back and getting service and the level of care from us as a practitioner, which does derive value and income in the form of production for the practice. And as we look to sell the business, any acquiring doctor does want to know how much money is this practice incurring and deriving on a yearly basis. And the third factor that goes into that appraisal is the lease itself. The transferability of that lease, the terms, commitments, obligations within that lease agreement, but also the economics, because as we go through the assignment of the lease agreement, there is a question as to fair market value of rental rates, and if the rental rates are way above market, the practice loses its incentive, it loses that glow that it may have had if it did have high production, just given that the overhead costs would be quite considerable to operate the business. Very often, the rent rates are the second highest cost that we incur as a doctor. From our occupancy costs are very expensive, rental rates and additional costs do factor into our overhead costs. And, obviously from the beginning, we do want to get the lowest cost and have occupancy costs that are fair and reasonable. But we also do need to take that in consideration as we look to transfer the practice, because that will factor into the desirability of your business. If the rental rates are way above market, low desirability. If they're below market, very desirable. So there's 4 concepts I'd like to discuss today. That one being economics, protections, flexibility, and risk. When we look at the office lease agreement, at the foundation, the economics are very important. What the rent rates are they in line with the market? At any option period, do we have the option to renegotiate the rent rates based on fair market value? We also do want to take into consideration the escalations. Typically, on an annual basis in commercial real estate, we see a 3% year-over-year increase in rent rates. We do want to ensure that if rents are going up, that they are based on fair market values and CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as opposed to an arbitrary figure that a landlord can pass. So for those of you that do have a copy of your lease agreement, I do challenge you to take a look at that and determine what the escalations are year over year. My recommendation and what we recommend internally is if there are escalations, at least that they need to be 3% escalations year over year. And then, of course, the variable cost, the fixed cost being the fixed rental rate. When we get in negotiations, we typically determine a fixed rental rate on a per square footage basis, whether that be $10 a square foot, $15 a square foot, $25 a square foot, or in places like Manhattan, New York, $150 a square foot. So depending on the market, obviously rent rates are very different based on market conditions and traffic flow and populations and demographics. But the one factor that we can control or have a level of control that is variable is the triple net cost. 90% of office lease agreements that I review on a daily or weekly basis are triple net leases. Not only are we obligated to pay our base rental rates, which are fixed, but we do have additional costs in the form of triple net. And when I refer to triple net, I'm referring to the acronym TMI: taxes, maintenance, and insurance. And they are controllable economics if we do add language into the lease agreement that ensures that the landlord cannot pass on any arbitrary numbers for triple net costs, such as increasing maintenance costs, redeveloping the property, doing a facelift of the property, whether it's on the facade or doing interior paint work. As tenants, we are obligated to pay a percentage based on our square footage in relation to the total square footage of the property, which is our prorated expense. So prorated expense would be our square footage for the practice, let's say for hypothetical purposes, 2,000 square feet. in relation to a 10,000 square foot property, which would mean we are obligated to pay 20% of TMI, taxes, maintenance, insurance. It's a maintenance cost. Based on experience, maintenance cost is where we often see discrepancy between landlord and tenant. Critical that we do have some elements to have a checks and balances. Not only do we receive a statement breaking down the cost of those triple net costs, but also have the right to audit landlord's books to ensure that they are consistent with what we are expected to pay as a tenant on a triple net lease. We do want to incorporate protections into the lease agreement. So having long-term continuity in the term of lots of term. In most cases, when we're dealing with medical leases, we typically advise our clients, and of course it's really depending on the stage you are in your career, in structuring a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options. It provides you long-term predictability and continuity in your space, but options for you in the future to continue to operate in the space, as well as options for you to assign to any potential buyer so that they have long-term continuity when they acquire your business based on the appraised value of that business. We also do want to structure options to renew. Lots of options, the 2 5-year options in the lease agreement, which need to have the option structured at fair market value, so that when we do go through the options and expressing those options, that we do have the ability to go back and renegotiate the financial terms of the deal based on the current market conditions. We do also want to incorporate flexibility into the lease agreement, having assignment rights which will allow us to transfer the lease agreement with minimal landlord interference, having flexibility to not worry about continuous liability after the sale, so that we're not providing some form of a guarantee for any proposed buyer, and of course having these rights built into the lease where the landlord cannot condition metric or even derive some value, i.e. either increasing the rental rates or alternatively getting a proceed of the sale of your business. It does often hinder or cause a concern when we do have a prospective buyer looking to acquire, but the assignment language isn't clearly drawn out. Based on my experience, majority of the concerns that we have aren't during the term or while the doctor is occupying the space, but generally occurs when the doctor is looking to sell or assign the lease agreement. Landlords are very opportunist and understand that a new tenant is taking over the property who they do not have a relationship with, and will very often derive a very savvy profit or some form of income or value just to control that transfer. So we do want to create some flexibilities there. And again, having a death and disability provision, it sounds morbid in nature. It is a free insurance policy that protects your estate and now allows you to have the flexibility to terminate the lease, God forbid something happens to you and your health. We will also discuss some of the potential risks in an office lease agreement. In particular, for a medical practitioner, having items like a relocation or demolition clause built into the lease agreement are quite onerous to you as a tenant. Not favorable, given that our practice can be arbitrarily relocated, or ultimately our lease can terminate in the event the landlord is looking to demolish the building. We do see this very often in city centers, whereby landlords may have an older property and will eventually sell it to a real estate developer who is looking to redevelop the property, perhaps build a large condominium, as we're seeing all across Toronto now and parts of Edmonton and in particular Vancouver, where gentrification is happening to the city centers and there's a lot of demand and people demand for high-rises. And we often see some doctors, unbeknownst to them, that they have this demolition clause which allows the landlord to terminate their lease on 30 to 60 days notice. So critical that that is addressed in the lease agreement, or at least, the very least, we are aware of this relocation or demolition right, and we do have a conversation as to some remedies to offset any potential losses in the future if there is a relocation or demolition. So the first option, and we're going to move on to understanding particular elements in the office lease agreement. So the first element I'd like to discuss, and it's a provision called the options to renew. It's found in 90% of office lease agreements, where it metrics out, and we clearly see in a legal form what our rights are as a tenant to express our options. So I'll give you all a moment to review this, and if you can identify any potential risks, I will correct and go through it and point out any potential flaws in this particular option to renew provision, again, found in 90% of office leases. So the first item of merit to discuss is, provided that Dr. Joe Black. So provided that Joe Black shall remain as a tenant, and tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent, has performed its covenants and obligation under the lease, has not been in default, it shall have the option to renew this lease to a further term of 5 years, exercisable by landlord no less than 9 months prior to the end of the term. Any such renewal shall be on landlord's then current standard form lease at a minimum rent to be determined between landlord and tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. If the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on market rent within 60 days of the exercise by tenant of its option unit, the rent shall then be determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. Excuse me. The first item of merit of concern is provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain tenant. So this option is not assignable. So for example, if we have a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options and we assign the lease agreement in year 6, those 2 5-year options are exclusive to Dr. Joe Black. If Dr. Joe Brown acquired the business, those options are not exercisable by them. It's exclusive to Dr. Joe Black. We do want to add language that ensures that any options are transferable and can be inherited by the new or buying doctor in the property. The other issue here to be found in the lease agreement is any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So effectively, if we go through a formal negotiation and negotiate out critical terms in the lease agreement that can potentially pose a risk for us as a tenant, on the renewal as exercised and illustrated here in this option to renew provision, the landlord does have the right to provide a new standard form lease. And those are items, terms, conditions, and legal obligations that we are committing ourselves to that we're unaware of. We don't have a copy of the current new standard form lease. Quite frankly, there is no fundamental and consistent common lease agreement or standard form lease. It is an idea and concept often presented by landlords to state that there is a standard. There is no standard. Every lease is different based on market, demographics, geography, and a standard form lease is not consistent between different properties. With that being said, we do want to express any of our options based on the then current office lease agreement and terms and conditions within. The other issue of merit here is the landlord and tenant, but in no event shall be less than the rent paid in the original term of lease. So if, for example, the market went down significantly, right now we are at some of the heights in parts of the country of the real estate boom. Rent rates are very high. Rent rates are structured. Identifying a property per square foot is very expensive to do so. So in the lease agreement, if, for example, there is a correction to the marketplace, according to the provision in our lease, rents will only escalate and not take into consideration what's happening with the economy. Important that the economy is taken into consideration when expressing these options. And the final item in this lease agreement that is quite contentious is the rent shall be then determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. The challenge with that is, if, for example, the renewing tenant in the building that previously renegotiated the terms of their lease took a significant TI, tenant improvement allowance to do some paint work, perhaps replace the carpet, put in tiles, demolish walls, perhaps demise even a new space within the property itself, that TI is often rolled into the rent rates. It's not free money from the landlord, it's built into the rent rates. So very often if we see a doctor take a very high TI, the landlord will roll that and recuperate their damages by having a higher rent rate. However, if our option to renew in the lease agreement is based on the latest renewing tenant in the property, if they did have that higher rent rate because of the higher TI, then our expectation is to pay a higher rent rate based on what the previous doctor had negotiated or previous tenant had negotiated. Not a fan of that type of language. Landlords will push high TI onto other tenants in the property just so that they can increase the value of their property with this type of language because they understand that all renewing tenants will only go up based on the newest renewing tenant in the property. Landlords, very savvy landlords, will add this type of language into a lease, and unbeknownst to our clients, they're caught, almost like a deer in headlights, thinking that rent should be at a fair market value when, in fact, that rent rates that are proposed by the landlord are far higher than market. So again, we should need to have that addressed anytime we're dealing with any options to renew. The next item of merit, and quite frankly, it would be the most important element in any office lease agreement, is the assignment. And the assignment effectively means and is defined as our ability and rights to transfer and sell the business. At some point in time, as we move forward in our career, we will begin to start to entertain our transition plan. And as I mentioned early on in the webinar, critical that we structure our healthcare real estate plan with our transition plan, and when we eventually plan on, putting down the office lab coat and putting away the stethoscope and retiring from the business, there needs to be a collaboration correlation between retirement plan and eventual transition plan. So the assignment language that's found here is found in 75% of medical office lease agreements, and I'll quickly read it. If the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. So number one issue here is we need to get consent to the landlord, which means the landlord has control over that transfer. Any request for such consent shall be in writing. Within 15 days after the receipt by the landlord of such request for consent, the landlord shall have the option to either terminate the lease or to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the current market rent or 15% greater than the current rent. So number one issue is, as soon as we notify the landlord we have a potential buyer, we've gone through the formal appraisal of the business, we're ready to shake hands on the deal and settle the asset purchase agreement for the sale of the practice. However, the only issue that lingers in the way of that transfer is the assignment of the lease agreement. And according to the conditions in this lease, as soon as we as a selling doctor look to transfer the lease and notify the landlord, we're on a 15-day shot clock to either rescind our offer or face the penalty of having revised minimum rent whereby it increases, or quite frankly having the landlord flat out terminate our lease agreement, where they state, if you're no longer wanting to be a tenant here, we are going to terminate your lease agreement. Again, with healthcare practice, there is a significant investment made in cabinetry, healthcare flooring, healthcare electrical. In many specialist office, we see sinks and plumbing that is attached to the premises. Again, these are items that are transferred and are part of the appraised value of the business. We do not want to have the lease agreement terminated by simply requesting to the landlord that we're going through a sale. The landlord should be quite glad that another doctor is looking to take over the space and will be there for many years to come. And the last part of that item, and this is quite often found, I would say even 90% of lease agreement, is that ongoing liability. Notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under lease and shall remain liable for any failure of tenants or its assignees. This is referred to as continuous liability. So even though we've sold the business and cut ties with the practice, according to this assignment language, which this particular element is found in, I would say, 90% of lease agreements, it is stating that we are providing some form of a guarantee for the buyer of your business. Not the biggest fan of that type of language. I'm from the school of thought that once I retire, I wipe my hands clean and I walk away from the practice and not having any emotional, financial, or legal attachment to the property or practice. However, in this circumstance, we are providing a guarantee for any potential buyer, and the landlord is asking us to secure that guarantee on their behalf. Not ideal. So absolutely need to amend this type of language to make it much more feasible to facilitate a transfer of that lease agreement. There are another number of other important elements in a medical office lease agreement. Part of today's webinar, we are able to offer a complimentary lease review whereby we would go through the legal and financial merits of your lease agreement, discuss strategy and how to negotiate those terms into your lease agreement. These are the number of items that we often take a look at. As you can see here, we only had the time in today's 1-hour lecture to cover a few of the items. However, there's over 18 items that need to be addressed when we are negotiating a healthcare lease agreement. So a significant process in place to have those conversations with landlords and educate them on why they are important to us as tenants in the property and our clients, and how it minimally impacts the landlord, however provides us as tenants a bit more flexibility. So again, I encourage you all to take a look at your lease agreement or have a copy secured, so that if you did want to have myself or one of my colleagues review that for you, we are absolutely able to do that on your behalf on a complimentary basis. One of my favorite slides in today's webinar is the tenant lease cycle. And I love educating doctors on this, because once they are aware of the timelines and the leverage stance that occurs by having greater time, they're much more appreciative of our level of understanding of strategy when it comes to renegotiation of the office lease agreement. From a structural standpoint, we do recommend that all doctors, when they're looking to renew their office lease agreement or relocate or expand, we do recommend beginning that process 24 months from expiration. It does provide our tenants with the ability to begin the process early and have conversations early on with the landlord to secure a long-term deal. Tenant cycle is critical. As we move further past the 12-month mark, our leverage significantly starts to diminish. It's important that we certainly begin before the 8-month part, because from a strategy standpoint, landlords understand the business of being a healthcare practitioner. As a healthcare practitioner, there is a requirement to have certain zoning, bylaws, healthcare requirements, disability acts in place within the lease, within the practice setup and startup. And with that being said, it's very difficult to negotiate when we have no other option except staying in the property. And that's where opportunist landlords come to the forefront. They realize the type of business you're in, how difficult it is to relocate the business, and will often begin the conversation or delay the conversation with their tenants until the very last moment, where they can present a take it or leave it deal and essentially win the negotiation just by stalling it out. One of the ways that we win these negotiations is beginning the conversation very early on and having those direct conversations with your landlord. Very, very important, particularly because there are a significant cost of relocating the business. Critical that we begin that process early. I would encourage all of you to take a look at your current lease agreement and determine when that lease is set to expire. Are there any options? Are they non-transferable? I'd be happy to do that on your behalf if you did have interest to do that. Again, I'll provide you my information at the end of the webinar, so that if anybody did have any specific questions, you could email, call, or send me a text message, and I'd be happy to address that on your behalf. So what is the right treatment plan? Over the course of our 25 plus years, we have very stringently built a treatment plan in place to have a successful negotiation, and I'll quickly and briefly go over that treatment plan. Number one would be to gather all documentation, gather all relevant information pertaining to the lease agreement and the negotiation of that lease, ensuring that we have all articles of incorporation, all real estate data conducted. Part of our division and the way that our group is structured is we have an in-house legal counsel as well as an in-house leasing division. Our leasing division will gather all documentation in the sense of getting all of the rental rates, property analysis, landlord analysis, seeing what dealings and correspondence we've had previously, whether it's with other clients or a personal dealing or personal relationship that we have. We like to gather all documentation and itemize them, sort them. Once we've identified all of documentation, we look to identify your practice and career goals. How long you plan on practicing? Is there interest in opening up multiple sites? Are we looking to sublet the space to another practitioner? What is the long-term plan for the practice? What is your career goals? When is our transition plan? And just to hammer it on the head again, important that we have an understanding, or at least a vague understanding, of what our transition plan looks like, because it is important from a real estate perspective to coordinate our real estate plan with our transition and eventually retirement plan. The next step is to review the office lease agreement, go through all the risk traps, any onerous terms, any potential issues that may harm the practice for being a long-term consistent tenant in the property. Once we've identified all the risks, one of our legal advisors would review that document and go over any potential items, as well as present to our group items that require amending and language changes that would effectively put you in the right position from a structural standpoint, legal and financially. Once we have all that information, we would prepare the market research, pull an updated report of average market rental rate, so that when it comes to negotiating the economics of the deal, we do have some data to support our arguments, comparable properties, availabilities, and essentially that is the science behind the economics of the deal. And we do have access to that information. Whether you're entertaining the idea of a new site or have identified a potential site for a practice, more than happy to have my leasing team pull out a property report to ensure that you're getting a deal based on fair market value. Once we've prepared the market research, we would develop an outcome and strategy and development plan. What areas of the lease have issues, what issues are there, what our concerns are with them, and then providing resolution, courses of action to immediately receive and then get those items out of the lease agreement, or at the very least have a conversation with the landlord in terms of what our strategy and long-term plan is and how their property fits that bill. Once the outcome has been devised, we would then move on to negotiating the economics. It is critical from the beginning to get the economics right. We don't want an over-the-market rental rate, which, as I mentioned earlier, will hinder the saleability of your practice. But we do want to hammer and shake on the economics based on the information that my leasing team has provided, and negotiate deals with the landlord, whether it be base rental rates or a tenant improvement allowance or some landlord work. Those are all economic concessions that the landlord will be providing us, and ensuring that the lease is at fair market value. Once we have hammered down the economics and negotiated on the economics, we then move to the formal lease agreement. So we would go over all the terms, conditions, provisions that you as a doctor are obligated to fulfill, provide amendment and recommendation changes. Once we're retained, we ensure that all final review and execution has occurred, so that we have a final review by one of our in-house attorneys. We have a final copy of the lease agreement, and we have a final copy of the lease agreement, and that there's consistency between what we've negotiated and spent the last number of months negotiating and what that final form of that lease is, so that we're comfortable with you signing that lease with no issue. So what is the evolution of a physician's career? As a practitioner, after spending many years in school, educating us and getting the formal training, once we become a business owner or entertain the idea of becoming a business owner, there is an evolution to the career. When we start up at an early onset after being an associate or being a resident at a practice, we often see that there is significant costs that are incurred to start up a business. So we do want to ensure that at the beginning of our career, we have lots of term on the lease, the 10-year plus 2 5-year options, that we have options to renew that are transferable to any potential buyer, that we have a death and disability placed into the lease agreement, and that we have cost controls in check, particularly on the triple net cost, getting statement and audit right controls. Following the 10 years, we would go through a renewal. A very different conversation to be had when we go through the renewals. We do want to begin to mitigate any personal liability or exposure under the lease agreement. Now that we've proven our business worthiness as a tenant, paid rents on time, haven't been in default of the lease, have been a great tenant for the landlord of the property, have been providing capital to them on a timely manner, we look on the renewal to remove that guarantee, limit that guarantee, or absolutely absolve it from the lease agreement. We do want to ensure that we have more renewals and options in the lease, that we have long-term continuity as we move forward in our career. Ensure that any buyer has more terms and options. But then we also want to have associate rights. As we begin to plan for our transition plan, more than likely we'll bring on an associate that would be working under our wings on our behalf. We do want to ensure that according to the lease agreement, that is not deemed a subtenancy and it's simply a colleague working with you. For some doctors that are looking to expand the practice, gives you a great opportunity to reevaluate the lease agreement, understand what's in that lease, understand what needs to be changed, and how it can be done. We look to get rid of personal guarantees as well, ensure that there's terms and options, ensure that there's transferability, as well as ensuring that there's a death and disability. And final, last but not least, number 4, prepare for the transition. So sale and prep. Ensure that there's flexible and clean assignment language, that we're removing all personal guarantees, and in addition, operating under the premise that we do need to have additional term on the lease. Why we state that is, from a financing standpoint, many of the banks have underwriting standards that require anywhere from 5 to 7 years of business history and experience for that doctor to acquire the practice. So what the banks have really changed, and this is from an underwriting standpoint for me to clarify a little bit clearer, is when we get the practice appraised, very often the buyer of that business needs to go to the bank and acquire financing. The challenge is most doctors look at their lease agreement and they're at year 8 and they say, oh, that's fine and well, I have 2 years left on my lease, I'll assign it to any potential buyer. However, if we have a $500,000 practice and we're looking to do that, if the buyer does not have terms and options that they can express, then the lease agreement completely loses its value. We do want to ensure that any options and terms can be expressed by any future party or assignee or lessee, and that there's minimal interference. So what are some of the key takeaways from today's course? The details of your lease agreement can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars if left alone. We do invest significantly in leasehold improvements, cabinetry, sometimes plumbing, electrical, and being in the industry of healthcare, given hygiene guidelines and protocol, very often we're paying on the top line for very similar products for other industries, just given that there's a level of health and hygiene involved in a practice. We also want to ensure that the lease it's not only about rent. There's other terms, conditions, obligations within the lease that we do need to take in consideration as we continue to renegotiate the terms of this deal. We do want to minimize our risk, but however, maximize our flexibility and practice value, achieve long-term results, ensure that we have a long-term continuity within our lease, and that we can continue to practice and operate for as long as we so choose to do so, and that there's term for buyers to acquire the business and receive a loan from the bank and have an amortization period anywhere from 5 to 7, and in some cases 10 years for some of the banks. Be strategic, and it's very critical that we are very strategic. I'm a firm believer in lifting every rock and uncovering everything under every rock. When we take a look at the lease agreement, all items are addressed, all terms, conditions are evaluated by our team of consultants to ensure that you're aware of what you're committing to. But it's key that to be strategic in the sense that you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate into your lease. Even though we feel that we should have these certain rights and provisions, there are importantly that we ask the right questions and that we're asking the right questions about many things, because if we are committing for that long of a term of a lease, it is important that it's done correctly. And again, the last item I'd like to highlight from my favorite slide, a few slides back, is a 24-month leverage standpoint. As we move closer and closer to deadline, our leverage stance significantly diminishes. Very important that we start the process at least 24 months before expiration. So there are some items that I wasn't able to address in today's course. I know that we are a little bit short on time, but I'd be absolutely happy to address them, whether it's regarding cost-sharing agreements, co-tenancy agreements. I know many doctors partner up with some of their colleagues and operate under a cost-sharing agreement. I am able to provide some guidance there on how to structure the lease, whether it's both personal parties or structuring the lease under a corporate entity that both parties have a connection to or joint shareholders in. But again, happy to address any outstanding questions or concerns following the course. My cell phone number, it can be found below. Actually, that's our toll-free number, so if you do want to have a conversation, I'd be happy to facilitate it on your behalf and provide you some guidelines and understanding of your office lease agreement. So I do like to thank everyone for joining us today. It was a pleasure speaking with all of you, and I hope we gained a bit of valuable insight into the specific elements of an office lease agreement, more importantly, a dental-specific lease agreement within commercial real estate. Again, medical doctors are very highly desired by landlords. They do want you in their space. You drive great traffic to their property. Very often do not default on rent rates and continue to practice and deal with the space in the best condition. So again, my name is Jas Banga. It was a pleasure speaking with all of you. My contact information can be found here. Feel free to either give me a call or touch base via email. Thank you all, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your meeting. Thank you so much.